After 5 months of waiting, my Shellix helical cutter head finally arrived. And I wanted to make a good comprehensive video of the installation into a jet 15-inch planer. When I started looking for good installation videos and what I could expect, I wasn't very satisfied with what I found. Manufacturer-produced videos looked like they were done in a lab where everything went right the first time. And admittedly, I didn't look that hard, but I couldn't find a video specific to a jet 15-inch 4-post planer. But to be honest, the design of this planer is so ubiquitous that I was able to see at least a few videos that made me more comfortable with the process of what I was getting into. Have you ever noticed how all these different brands of 15-inch planers look pretty much the same? And that's because for the most part they are. So I think what I show in this video would help anyone who is getting ready to install a Shellix cutter head, even if it wasn't in a jet planer. So let's jump in. This is what you get from Byrd, and here are the instructions. They're okay, but don't cover everything. I started by removing the pulley and belt cover. Right away I found out that trying to loosen the bolt that holds on the upper pulley was not going to work. The pulley, which is directly attached to the cutter head, just wanted to spin when I tried to loosen the bolt. So to hold the cutter head in place, I raised some wood blocks up against it. This held the cutter head firmly in place and allowed me to break torque on the bolt. As per the instructions, I rotated the keyway to the 12 o'clock position. Now, Byrd's instructions said I'd be able to pull the pulley off easily without releasing belt tension. Well, they were wrong. For my machine, the motor is mounted on the bottom. I got down on the ground and loosened up the nut on the tensioning post. With this done, I was able to easily remove the belts, and the upper pulley slid right off. The keyway took a little persuasion. Next, I removed the dust collection shaft. And take this moment to point out that all the hardware on this machine is metric. So in addition to metric mechanics tools, a dead blow hammer and a gear puller were essential. After the dust collection shroud was off, I removed the top cover. After this, my next move should have been to remove the installed blades, but I didn't do that. I survived. Next, I removed the hand crank, and when doing this, you have to be careful to not lose the keyway. It is very small. The back of the gearbox cover has two little triangular dust guards bolted onto it. They're a little inaccessible, but not that hard to remove. And incidentally, I didn't include any step in this video that didn't prove to be totally essential. Almost every shot is sped up between 2 and 6 times for pacing reasons, but I tried to cover the entirety of every single action I had to go through to change this cutter head out. Once those back dust guards were off, I took out the single bolt that holds on the gearbox cover. These gears spin the infeed, outfeed, and lower rollers. To release the chain tensioner so I could swing it out of the way, I removed the little spring bracket in the middle of the gears. Alright, this isn't essential. I thought I'd be cute and put the bolts back in and keep the little spring clip in the same spot. That ended up being a dumb thing to do. I used a piece of masking tape to keep the tension idler up and out of the way. And then I removed the 3 bolts that hold on the gears. All 3 of these gears pulled off without any problems, and I made sure to keep good track of where the keyways ended up. For the next part, I had to temporarily reinstall the hand crank. The instructions tell you to raise at least a 3-layer thick stack of 2x4s into the cutter head. I think any amount of wood close to that will do. Next, I removed the 4 bolts that hold the gearbox to the machine. Using the dead blow, I next pounded on the pulley end of the cutter head. You really can't be delicate about this kind of job. Once the cutter head bearing cleared the pulley side, the entire cutter head and gearbox assembly slid right out. Once I was about to pull it out though, I did think better of those knives that I never removed and put on gloves. Be sure not to set the filled gearbox on its side, the oil will leak out of the top bolt holes. The instructions suggest setting the entire assembly on the outfeed rollers to drain the gearbox. It worked pretty well. The instructions also said to reuse the oil. My planer is 20 years old, and looking at this stuff, there was no way I was going to reuse it. With the gearbox drained, I then removed the 5 bolts that hold the gearbox halves together. Now, I'll just take this time to warn you that splitting this gearbox and putting it back together was by far the worst or most complicated part of this entire process. In retrospect, the whole thing went fairly smoothly, but this was what I was worried about the most, and it did prove to be the most challenging part. The instructions said to tap the gearbox till the 2 halves came apart, and that was laughable. Eventually I did resort to using a flathead screwdriver to pry these 2 sides apart, but I went very slow and took the best care I could to not damage the gasket. What I didn't initially realize is I wasn't just trying to get the 2 halves to separate from the gasket and each other, I was also trying to get the bearings to come out of their races. After fighting with this thing for 5 or 6 minutes, it finally came apart. Now the instructions showed all those gears coming off with the front cover that I just pulled out, and on my gearbox they all stayed right in the inner side. At first I didn't realize that this would be a problem, so I went ahead and removed the cutter head bearing retaining bolt and washer. Next I removed the gear that's directly bolted to the cutter head itself. It's hard to see, but it's removed by pulling out an M6 Allen head that's inside of the gear. At this point, I still had kind of a misguided idea that I could get the cutter head removed without taking out those 2 gears. So I tried putting a really long M6 bolt that I had lying around into there and pounding on it to see if maybe I could get it to break free, but that really did not work. I did manage to get the little gear that's keyed onto the cutter head to come off though. Eventually I realized that this would be the only way, and it really was the best way. I cut up a piece of scrap wood to make a spacer, and I pulled that big gear out of the back half of the gearbox. To hold the gearbox and cutter head assembly while I worked on it, I just put 2 pieces of plywood on the infeed roller of the planer and set the thing down in between it. This worked pretty well. I decided to get the outer half of the gearbox back fully together before I proceeded. This gearbox is really just a little 2-speed transmission, and it looks more complicated than it is, but I didn't want to mix anything up. After I got that first gear and bearing back in there, I realized there was an order that these had to be put in, and I was not following it. Tapping them all in together at the same time was really the best way. Well, using an arbor press would probably be better, but work with what you got. Now, unfortunately, as you can see here, that black oil seal on the big gear on the left did not go in properly. I thought I got it properly seated here, but as I found out later, I was wrong. This little rod and fork that I'm putting in right now is for changing speeds on the infeed roller. It goes between 20 feet per second and 16 feet per second. By pushing it in and out, you can see how it moves the gears between one set and another to change the speeds. I then return to make some more laughably futile attempts at removing the cutter head from the gearbox. Once again, it was the gear puller to the rescue. With the cutter head finally removed, getting the bearing out was easy. Getting the oil seal itself out, though, was a little more confounding. On a newer planer, this might not be necessary, but Byrd recommended on one as old as mine to change this oil seal. Eventually I realized it was just pressed in there and sticking, so I used a socket with an extension to get it out. With the oil seal removed, I installed a brand new gearbox side bearing. Now this part I forgot to film, so I'm kind of recreating it. The oil seal's already in there. Basically, it just went in and was tapped in the same way. A second set of hands, or maybe putting the cutter head in a vise, would have been good here. But I was able to get the gearbox side of the cutter head into the bearing without too much difficulty. I then tapped the cutter head gear onto the cutter head itself. The machining was a little rough, but it went on okay. Getting the screw in was also a little more difficult going into the new threads of the cutter head. If you watch this, you can tell that the gear itself is on a little wonky, but eventually once I got that bolt fully seated, it was on there perfectly straight. I'll mention this here, you definitely want to thoroughly wrap the cutter head itself to protect your hands. The corners of those blades are sharp. Then I reinstalled the bearing retaining bolt and washer. At this point, I put the oil gasket back on and put the outer half of the gearbox in place. I was worried about how this was going to go, but it turned out that just bouncing it on the cutter head itself and tapping the outer half of the gearbox on worked really well. I did, however, accidentally pound that little clip that holds the spring for the tension idler. Next, I reinstalled the 5 bolts that hold the gearbox together. I got them all finger snug and then tried to do somewhat of a star pattern as I tightened them all. I temporarily reinstalled the gearbox bolts to prevent any oil from leaking out when I filled it. I then took off the side fill port and refilled the gearbox with approximately the same amount of oil that I removed. The instructions said to use 50 weight oil, which was what was specified in the original owner's manual, and that proved to be a little hard to find. Grizzly recommended using 90 weight on what looked to be the exact same planer, so that's what I did. If anyone knows a reason why this was a horrible idea, please leave it in the comments and I'll change the oil out. Now, remember earlier when I mentioned getting that oil seal properly seated? Well, it leaked. I ended up having to take the entire thing apart, reseat that seal, and put it all back together. The second time, it did not leak. The Shellix cutter head comes with the pulley side bearing already installed. So at this point, I was able to tap the entire cutter head and gearbox assembly back in, much in the exact same way I removed it. It did take a little while to get the pulley side bearing fully seated on the cutter head, and I did raise the bed up and down a little bit to get the gearbox bolts to align. Once everything was lined up, I tightened the 4 gearbox bolts back in. I then reinstalled the keyways for the feed rollers and I reinstalled the chain rollers. Always remember to wipe the blood off before you put the gear on. This isn't like a timing belt on an engine. If you have to advance the gears a little bit to get everything to line up, it'll be fine. Once all the gears and chain were back on, I put on the retaining bolts. Off camera, I had pounded the spring clip back flat again and reinstalled it. I then reconnected the idler tension spring. With that done, I removed the wood blocks. At this point, I was able to remove the protective cover that I had put on the Shellix cutter head. Along with the cutter head itself, I had purchased a breakaway style torque limiter. I then checked torque on all the cutter head screws. I'm glad I did this because I found a few that were a little looser than I would have liked. With that torque check done, I reinstalled the upper pulley and the belts. Reinstalling the motor tension mount was next. I took the handle off one last time so I could reinstall the gearbox cover. Next, I reinstalled the back dust shields on the gearbox cover itself. Then the hand crank went on for the last time. The penultimate step was reinstalling the upper cover and the dust collection shroud. And the final step. This sticker probably added like 2-3 horsepower at least. And then, with breath held, I turned it on. Listen to how quiet it is. Here's a clip from an old video of how loud the old straight blade cutter was. Before running any wood through the planer, I checked the in and out feed rollers to see if they were moving and to check the changing of speeds. For my first test, I planed a rough cedar fence board. This was a very light pass on soft wood, so you can still see the in-feed roller indentations, but it came out well. Next, I did a test on a piece of mahogany. As compared to the original and slightly dull straight knives, the surface finish was very impressive. My third test was a piece of Japanese cypress. I checked the entire 15-inch width of the cutter head during all my tests and found no indication of problems with the cutter head itself, and the cypress came out beautifully. For my last test, I planed some rough cut walnut. This was done with a few passes, but once again, I was very happy with the results. The full installation of the cutter head took me about 6 hours. I think if I hadn't been filming, I could have done it in 4. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. As always, thanks for watching.